Beyond encouragement, 4 principles that changed my teaching. On the first day of a high school summer program, one of my students arrived almost 2 hours late. After getting the student caught up, I explained that everyone would be beginning with a pre assessment to determine what they already knew. I also shared that students who demonstrated mastery on a unit's pre assessment would likely be able to move through portions of the course more quickly. About 20 minutes later, I noticed the student had fallen asleep. I gently woke the student up, but instead of continuing the assessment, they quickly selected random answers just so they could finish and go back to sleep. My first thought was, this is going to be a very long 10 days. At that moment, I assumed my biggest challenge would be keeping the student awake and getting them to complete their work. But I was completely wrong. 8 days later, that same student finished the course early. Even more surprisingly, the student told me they wanted to come back to class because they enjoyed being there and would be bored staying home. That experience left me asking one simple question: what changed? It wasn't that the math suddenly became easier. It wasn't that the student became more intelligent. And it definitely wasn't because I discovered some magical way to make math exciting. What changed was motivation. That experience stayed with me long after summer school ended because it revealed something important. I didn't understand motivation as well as I thought I did. Before taking this course, I believed motivating students meant encouraging them, creating engaging lessons, and helping them understand difficult content. While those things matter, I now realize they're only part of the picture. Throughout this semester, I studied several theories of motivation while also applying those ideas in authentic educational settings. As a result, my thinking began to shift. Instead of asking, how do I motivate students? I started asking, what actually influences motivation? That question became the foundation for everything I learned. Looking back at both the theories we studied and the experiences I had in the classroom, I noticed 4 ideas appearing over and over again. First, motivation begins with beliefs. Second, motivation grows through meaningful goals. Third, motivation thrives in supportive environments. And finally, motivation is strengthened through successful experiences. What's interesting is that each of these principles naturally connects to the next. Together, they completely reshaped not only how I understood motivation, but also how I think about teaching. Today, I'd like to share how each of these ideas changed the questions I ask as a teacher, and more importantly, one practical way teachers can bring each principle to life in their own classrooms. When I think back to that summer school student, I realized I was initially focusing on the wrong problem. I thought I needed to change the student's behavior. What I really needed to understand were the beliefs driving that behavior. Motivation begins with beliefs. One of the theories that had the greatest impact on me this semester was attribution theory. The theory suggests that when people experience success or failure, they naturally try to explain why it happened. Those explanations matter because they influence what people expect the next time they face a challenge. As I learned more about the theory, I kept thinking about my summer school students. Many of them didn't walk into the classroom believing they could be successful. Some had already convinced themselves they simply weren't math people. Others believed their previous failures meant they weren't capable of learning the content. Whether those beliefs were accurate or not, they influenced how students approached learning before I ever taught a lesson. That changed the way I viewed many of my students. Earlier in my teaching career, I often focused on behavior first. If a student wasn't participating or completing work, my instinct was to figure out how to increase engagement. Now, I find myself asking a different question. What does the student already believe about themselves? That question has changed many of my interactions with students. Instead of assuming students lacked motivation, I started paying closer attention to the language they used about themselves. When students said things like, I'm just bad at math, I stopped hearing those comments as excuses. Instead, I began recognizing them as beliefs that had likely developed over years of academic experiences. Once I understood that, my feedback changed as well. Rather than simply telling students whether an answer was right or wrong, I spent more time conferencing with them individually. We talked through their thinking, identified misconceptions, and discussed strategies they could use the next time they encountered a similar problem. Those conversations became opportunities to reshape how students saw themselves as learners instead of simply correcting mistakes. Over time, I noticed students becoming more willing to ask questions, attempt challenging problems, and participate in reassessments. Their mathematical understanding improved, but I believe something even more important was happening. Their beliefs about themselves were beginning to change. Over time, I came to understand that recognizing students' beliefs is only the first step. The bigger question became, how can teachers intentionally influence those beliefs? One way teachers can put this idea into practice is by using feedback as an opportunity to reshape students' beliefs. Feedback is about much more than correcting mistakes or assigning grades. Every interaction with a student communicates something about what we believe they're capable of accomplishing. One on one conferences are especially powerful because they allow teachers to understand students' thinking rather than simply evaluate their answers. During these conversations, we can ask students to explain their reasoning, address misconceptions, celebrate progress, and help them understand that mistakes are a normal part of learning rather than evidence that they are incapable. This approach reminds students that ability is not fixed. Growth happens through effort, effective strategies, and support. As educators, we have the opportunity to shape the story students tell themselves. When our feedback consistently communicates, you can learn this, students gradually begin believing it themselves. And when students begin believing they are capable of success, motivation often follows. For me, attribution theory transformed the way I think about feedback. It reminded me that every conference, every question, and every conversation has the potential to influence how students view themselves. And if motivation truly begins with beliefs, meaningful feedback may be one of the most powerful motivational tools we have. When we use feedback to reshape students' beliefs, we lay the foundation for lasting motivation. The next lesson I learned is this: motivation grows through meaningful goals. While studying achievement goal orientation theory, I learned that people don't simply work hard because they want to succeed. They work toward whatever they believe success looks like. In other words, the goals we emphasize often determine the behaviors we see. This idea became very real to me while serving as a teacher leader during a high school math summer program. About halfway through the program, I was asked to monitor student progress across several math classrooms. As I reviewed the data, I noticed many students were further behind than expected. I met with the teachers to better understand what was happening. During our conversation, several teachers explained that students were spending a great deal of time completing tutorials, practice activities, and assignments. Everyone was working hard, yet students weren't making the progress we had hoped for. As I listened, something became clear. The issue wasn't a lack of effort or a lack of training. The issue was that we had unintentionally defined success differently. Many of us had started measuring success by how much coursework students completed, but the purpose of the program wasn't completion, it was mastery. At that moment, achievement goal orientation theory suddenly felt much more concrete. The theory suggests that the goals we emphasize influence how people approach learning. If the goal is simply finishing work, people naturally focus on completion. But when the goal becomes learning, growth, and mastery, behavior begins to shift in a different direction. Once we redefined success around mastery instead of completion, the conversations among teachers changed almost immediately. Instead of asking, how do we get students through all of the assignments? Teachers began asking, how can I help this student master this concept? What score demonstrates mastery? Where can I provide additional support? Since then, I've come to realize that this principle extends far beyond summer school. Every classroom communicates a different definition of success, whether we intend it to or not. Students are constantly asking themselves, What does success look like in this classroom? If success only means earning the highest grade, students often become hesitant to take risks because mistakes feel costly. But when success includes learning, improving, asking questions, revising work, and demonstrating growth over time, students become much more willing to engage in challenging learning experiences. One way teachers can put this principle into practice is by clearly defining success before students begin learning. That means talking about more than grades. It means helping students understand that success can also include perseverance, thoughtful questions, collaboration, revision, and mastery developed over time. Achievement absolutely deserves to be celebrated. Students should be proud when they accomplish difficult goals. At the same time, achievement cannot be the only measure of success. When students believe that learning itself is valued, not just the final score, they become more willing to take risks, persist through challenges, and continue growing. When we clearly define what success looks like, we give students a meaningful goal worth pursuing. And meaningful goals fuel lasting motivation. The third principle that emerged throughout this semester is this: motivation thrives in supportive environments. One thing this course reinforced for me is that motivation isn't shaped only by what students believe or the goals they pursue. The environment students experience every day matters too. In many cases, it matters more than we realize. When I think back to the student I introduced at the beginning of this presentation, I realize they taught me this lesson better than any textbook ever could. On the first day, I thought the biggest challenge was keeping that student awake and getting them to complete assignments. By the end of the program, that same student had finished the course early and wanted to keep coming back to class because they enjoyed being there. As I thought about the transformation, one thing became very clear. It wasn't the curriculum or the standards, and it definitely wasn't the math itself. The difference was the student's experience in the classroom. As the days went on, our classroom became a place where students felt comfortable asking questions, working with one another, and making mistakes without embarrassment. It became a place where students felt safe enough to learn. That experience changed the way I think about classroom climate. As we studied contextual influences on motivation, I began to understand why those experiences mattered so much. Research consistently shows that motivation is influenced by whether students feel safe, valued, and connected within their learning environment. That reminded me that teachers influence much more than academic learning. We influence whether students are willing to participate, whether they raise their hand, whether they ask for help, whether they take risks when learning becomes difficult, and whether they continue trying after making mistakes. Earlier in my career, I viewed classroom climate as something students experienced once instruction began. Today, I see it differently. I believe classroom climate starts the moment students walk through the door. Students are constantly receiving messages from us. They notice the way we greet them, they notice how we respond to mistakes, they notice whether collaboration is encouraged. Even the physical environment communicates expectations about learning. Those small interactions may seem insignificant in the moment, but over time, they shape students' willingness to engage. One practical way teachers can apply this principle is by creating belonging before expecting engagement. It's easy to assume students will participate simply because we've planned a good lesson, but engagement becomes much more likely when students first feel that they belong. Fortunately, creating belonging doesn't require elaborate activities. It happens through simple, consistent actions. Learn students' names, show genuine interest in their lives, normalize mistakes as part of learning, celebrate growth publicly while addressing mistakes privately, encourage collaboration rather than competition, create routines that communicate every student's presence matters. Those small actions help create psychological safety, and psychological safety often becomes the foundation for academic risk taking. When students feel that they belong, they're far more willing to engage, and engagement is where meaningful learning begins. The final principle that tied everything together for me is this: motivation is strengthened through successful experiences. As the semester progressed, I began noticing how this idea connected all of the others. Students can believe they're capable. They can work through meaningful goals, they can learn in a supportive environment, but eventually they need to experience success for themselves. That's what transforms belief into confidence. During the summer program, I spent a great deal of time conferencing with students, reviewing misconceptions, providing additional instruction, and allowing reassessments after students demonstrated greater understanding. Those experiences reminded me that success isn't always immediate. Sometimes students simply need a different path forward. Sometimes they need another explanation, another strategy, another opportunity. Or sometimes they just need someone to sit beside them and work through the challenge with them. What stood out most was that students didn't become more motivated because I repeatedly told them they could succeed. They became more motivated after they actually experienced success. Each successful quiz, each mastered concept, each productive reassessment, each moment when something finally clicked. Those experiences gradually changed how students viewed themselves as learners. One of the biggest shifts in my thinking this semester involved the role of encouragement. I used to believe encouragement was the primary driver of motivation. Now, I view it differently. Encouragement tells students they can succeed. Successful experiences convince them they can. That's a powerful difference. Every meaningful success gives students another reason to believe they're capable of overcoming the next challenge. That's how confidence develops, not through empty praise, not through repeated reassurance, but through authentic accomplishment. One way teachers can apply this principle is by intentionally creating opportunities for students to experience success. That doesn't mean lowering standards, and it doesn't mean making learning easier. It means providing the support students need to reach challenging goals. Sometimes that's meaningful feedback, sometimes it's scaffolding, sometimes it's a one-on-one conference, and sometimes it's offering another opportunity to demonstrate learning after additional support. Those experiences send powerful messages to students. Your first attempt doesn't define you. Learning is a process. Growth is possible. You are capable of improvement. Those messages become much more meaningful when students experience evidence of them for themselves. As I look across the four principles I've shared today, I don't see four separate ideas. I see a sequence. Students begin believing they can learn. They pursue meaningful goals. They learn in supportive environments. And ultimately, they experience success. Together, those experiences create motivation that extends far beyond a single lesson, a single course, or even a single teacher. When students experience authentic success, motivation becomes something they carry with them, not something teachers constantly have to provide. As I think back on this semester, I realized that the question I asked at the beginning of this presentation, what changed, doesn't have just one answer. The students changed not because they suddenly became smarter, not because the content became easier, and not because I discovered some perfect way to motivate them. What changed were the experiences they had. Their beliefs about themselves began to shift. The goals they were working toward became more meaningful. The classroom became a place where they felt supported and valued. And over time, they experienced enough success to begin seeing themselves as capable learners. When those pieces came together, motivation followed. Looking back, I can confidently say that my understanding of motivation has changed in ways I didn't expect. At the beginning of this course, I viewed motivation primarily as something teachers created through encouragement engaging lessons, and positive relationships. I still believe those things matter, but now I understand they're only part of a much larger picture. Today, I see motivation as something that develops through a combination of beliefs, goals, environments, and experiences. It's not something we simply give students, it's something that grows when the conditions are right. In just a few weeks, I'll welcome a new group of students into my classroom. Some of them will walk through the door excited about math. Others will arrive convinced they aren't good at it. Some will be confident. Others will be carrying years of frustration, doubt, and previous failures with them. Because of this course, I'll view those students differently than I would have a semester ago. Before I think about the lessons I want to teach, I think about the beliefs my students are bringing with them. I'll think about the goals I'm communicating. I'll think about whether my classroom feels safe enough for students to take risks and make mistakes. And I'll think about how I can intentionally create opportunities for students to experience success. I know there are many factors that influence student motivation that I can't control. I can't control what happened before students entered my classroom. I can't control every challenge they face outside of school. And I can't control every belief they've developed about themselves. But I now understand that I have tremendous influence over what happens once they walk through my classroom door. I'd like to leave you with one final thought. As educators, we often ask ourselves, how can I motivate my students? After everything I've learned this semester, I don't think that's the question I'll be asking anymore. Instead, I'll be asking, what kind of classroom am I creating that allows motivation to grow? Because when students believe they can succeed, when they understand what success truly looks like, when they feel that they belong, and when they experience authentic success, motivation becomes something much more powerful than encouragement alone. It becomes part of how students see themselves. And that kind of motivation lasts far beyond a single lesson, a single course, or even a single teacher. It stays with them as learners. Encouragement may inspire students to begin, but the experiences we create are what inspire them to continue.